All righty. This is going to be one that probably goes the distance. We're going to try to keep it's an hour-long presentation. It's a fairly interesting topic. A lot of people wonder, what's the easiest way to get a time extension granted on a project. A lot of times, I come from the dispute world, and you see these situations where projects are delayed, but nobody wants to accept that, even though the reality is they're not going to get done on time. And time is money. In construction, it takes a lot of money to be there an extra month or 2 or 3. And the bigger the project, the worse it gets, because you got to pay for the trailers, you got to pay for the people. That's true for the GC, that's true for the CM. But at the same time, the owner doesn't want it to be late. They don't want to admit that it's late. They want you to do everything in your power to make sure that it gets done on time. But at some point in time, we just have to, look at the delays, understand the delays, and, make a decision, which comes with an analysis. And we're going to talk about that. What we want to really get everybody here to is having that conversation successfully, making sure that everybody's on the same page of why did this happen, and is it, what do we do as a result, and make sure that the contractor isn't sitting there worried about never getting compensated for it. So what we prepared here is, some ways in which you can approach that issue and get to a point where, you get that relief, you have that conversation, and successful ways to do that. A lot of people have asked us the question. Our goal here is to teach you today. Who's going to be presenting? It's myself. I'm Michael Pink, founder and CEO of SmartPM Technologies. I spent a lot of time doing schedule and delay analysis, about 20 years. Took that experience and now built a software that analyzes schedule data from many different ways. We're looking at project controls, we're looking at delays, performance analysis, for all parts and pieces of the job, different subs, different milestones. I saw the schedule as being one of the most useful data sets. And then I know it takes a long time to actually dig into the schedule data and prepare an analysis that's, useful in managing outcomes, as well as, de-risking the job, and even getting to a point where you understand what delays are happening and why. Billy is on here as well. He's a product manager at SmartPM, but he is also a former colleague of mine at some of the consulting firms we've worked at. So he's very experienced, but he's also been here at SmartPM since the beginning of building our technology, and now he's our product manager. He's the one who works with the customers. He learns their pain points, and he gets their thoughts and ideas and brings them to life via our technology. He's one of the innovators for our company. So we'll be talking about this concept here of why and how do we prepare these extensions for time. We're going to talk about a few different types of analyses here that are useful, but we want to also talk about, well, why do we have to do this, and what's the best way to approach it, and pros and cons of each way. There's a few different analysis techniques that we'll talk about. But why is time of the essence in construction? This was a big question that I had always needed to answer, because I was always getting pulled in to situations where the project was getting late and over budget. And I was always wondering, well, how did this happen? Everybody seemed to agree to something, and then it didn't come to life on way too many projects. But, time is of the essence in construction for a lot of reasons. Number one, a lot of different stakeholders are involved, and it's complex. Things are never done in accordance with the plan. And that's just because there's a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different people involved, a lot of different entities involved. And with each one of those entities, there's people involved. And when you have a group of people, and we're not talking like 3 people, we're talking hundreds, if not in some cases thousands of people, which include the tradesmen, it includes the, GC, the project managers, the supers, the engineers, the architects, the owner side, account managers and asset managers and all the foremen, and there's just a ton of different people involved, estimators, accounting. owner side, cities getting, permits and all that stuff. Everybody seems to, have a bunch of different interests happening, and they're not just doing it on one project. A lot of cases, there's a lot of different projects that they got to focus on, and trying to manage all that and make sure that everything goes to plan is a challenge, particularly because of the, the complexity of these projects. And there's also, external factors that come into play. Weather, labor shortages, supply chain disruptions are ones that we're seeing today. Escalated costs, all little things that affect, budgets and timelines. The other thing is, in a lot of cases when we're looking at, winning a job, most people are trying to come up with the best duration that they can possibly think of to get it done, and they're thinking a best case scenario. They're not necessarily intertwining risk into the equation. So, that's generally sets up the project to be prone to delays and time extensions just from the get-go. And that's all about, what we call planning fallacy. As you're building out these schedules, you're thinking of durations, and you're thinking of logic, and you're thinking of, if everything, works out in a best case scenario. You're not thinking, well, it might rain sometimes. There might be plenty of RFIs, so let's extend the duration on this and that. There's going to be plenty of tradesmen, so let's put this crew logic in there that represents multiple crews that we're going to be able to get. You're not thinking of the times where people aren't able to show up. And the other piece is it's expensive. Delay is expensive. So we've got this conundrum that's happening where projects are overly aggressive to begin with, and we see that in our data. But they're also, not necessarily thinking about, the extension of time and how much money that is. And as things unfold, and as all these different moving parts are not coming together in accordance with plan, we generally see dates slip, and that requires a discussion. So we generally see this as a pattern in construction. So that's why time is an issue and why it's of the essence. There are ways to do a good job of managing time that we'll talk about before we get into, well, how do we actually request an extension of time? But, I'm a big believer in the CPM scheduling technology. I believe that CPM scheduling technology is a useful tool. It's not just about building a schedule that, prints out activities on a page. It's about leveraging these calculations that come with the program about the critical path, near critical paths, as well as float values that can, ultimately show you when something becomes critical based on delays that are happening. Being flexible and adaptable with the plan, knowing that when you set up a schedule at the beginning of a job, that's probably not going to be the way it pans out. Things are going to change. You're going to learn a few things. You're going to change some sequences due to challenges that are happening. Some things are not going to show up on time, and you're going to have to, resequence things, and you're going to have to continue working in some areas and not be able to work in others. Or you might realize that different trades are needing to work around certain things, or change orders are happening, or you're going to you have stopped work due to RFIs. And, all these different things, you're going to have to be adaptable, because, when you are not, nobody here is can see the future. We can use our best judgment when creating a plan. But as we update that schedule, we have to take lessons learned over time. When you're making those changes, you have to, oh, by the way, it doesn't look like my camera's on. I'll turn my camera on real quick. When you're making these changes, we need to be sure that we can, I'm going to move that. We need to make sure that we've got buy-in too. When you come up with a plan and you get everybody on board and then things start to change, you can't just shorten durations and adjust logic and stack trades without actually having a conversation with the companies involved. So you have to make sure that, any sort of changes are being discussed. And I know that some contracts say to the subs, like, you're going to do what we tell you to do, and then you're going to show up with the amount of people we need to, but sometimes it's just impossible. And you create a plan that's impossible, you end up getting in a situation where it's not going to pan out, and that's prone to delay too. Communication's important, having these regular meetings. I think a lot of people are starting to adopt a pull planning and lean construction methodologies, which come with a lot of discussion and a lot of buy-in, but really getting also into, the next phase, which a lot of people sort of skip when they're updating a schedule, is studying delays. understanding inefficiencies, impact, changes, mitigation strategies, not when the schedule's out of whack, but generally probably every week if you can. Definitely every update, discussing what happened last month. And this again gets into the lean. And then the last one, which is one area that we see is a bit of a challenge, is admitting and discussing delay and causation regularly. I always found it very interesting that people were waiting until way too late to discuss these things, because it was almost like it was admitting failure. But the reality is, when you have an overly optimistic schedule to begin with, and that's just the nature of construction, and you got a lot of moving parts, things will get delayed. 70 or 80% of projects are delayed. Actually, 82% of projects are delayed if you study, the data that we've studied. And that's a big number. It's basically saying, we are over aggressive and the thing's going to get delayed. We need to discuss that. Until the world gets to a place where it's, honest with its plan and risk adjusting it from the get-go, we're never going to see a world where people are not surprised that the end date kicked out. Nobody likes to discuss delay, but it's just generally happening. And discussing delay and causation regularly actually builds a good rapport between owner and contractor. As generally the site team believes that delay is a taboo word, and I know that because we interviewed thousands of people. But having that discussion actually results in better outcomes, because it gives the owner and the contractor something to talk about and communicate on and collaborate on, and that actually builds a good rapport, even though it's not a fun conversation, especially if there's a lot of finger pointing. But that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do we eliminate that finger point. So how do we successfully prepare a time extension request? Well, number one, we use schedule data, and that schedule data needs to be accurate. If it's all messy, inaccurate start dates and finish dates, then that starts to, result in, a question of integrity. If we're using data that's not accurate, that's the first area where somebody's going to go, hey, well, you're asking me for this time, but I'm studying the data and I'm looking at the photos and it's not jiving with accuracy. And what we're talking about here is accurate start dates, finish dates, and percent completes. And what I find a lot of times is when you're doing, schedule updates that are, once a month or even once every 2 months, you've got to go back in time and actually look at start dates, finish dates, and percent completes. And most people aren't sitting there recording that data, and they're going off of memory. And then when they start going off of memory, those dates can be off, which, lends to the idea that you want to be updating more frequently. Some of the most successful companies that I see are updating weekly, because you can remember the last 5 days pretty accurately. You can't remember the last 30 days accurately. And most supers and PMs that are updating the schedule are not doing it, especially at the end of a month. They're not sitting there going to their notes, and they're not taking the best notes to do it. And they're really relying on memory or, in some cases, photos. But if you're just doing it every week, it doesn't take more time. You're updating a quarter as many activities. Then it actually takes more time if you do it monthly. You're going to have to spend a whole day trying to remember everything. So number one, utilize your schedule data, but make sure it's accurate, and let's make sure it's objective. We don't want, one message you'll hear here is we're not looking to spin the truth. If you start getting, spinning the truth and you get caught doing that as a contractor, the owner doesn't trust you anymore. And that's not a good place to be, is when you get caught trying to make up a story. And trust me, it happens. I think we all don't want to admit failure, and a lot of times we can see people that are trying to spin the truth or spin the story a little bit, and that becomes subjective. And when somebody's working with someone who's a little subjective, that starts to scare them a little bit, and then they're going to question your integrity. So being objective, being honest, being accurate is number one. Number two, there's 3 methodologies that I'll recommend here. When you're doing a request for time extension using the schedule data, there's the contemporaneous period analysis, which is called a windows analysis. And I like this analysis a lot because it factors in the ability to make changes and accept changes from the original plan. There's this as planned, as built analysis, which basically says, you had a plan at the beginning and that's the only plan that matters. But in reality, at each update period, you make changes. People make changes. Sometimes those changes are a little too aggressive, and we're going to talk about that. But in reality, you know, I like to think that changes are necessary because you're learning and you're resequencing. And I like to trust that, and based on all the contractors I've met, you know, very, very, you know, they use the scheduling process to get the job done and get it done right. But there is always this stigma out there that sometimes people pencil whip the schedule to tell a story, and that starts to get people scared at these update periods. But to me, the Windows methodology, at least when it comes to delay analysis, is probably the most widely accepted. Then there's what's called a prospective TIA, which is a forward-looking view of an impact before it happens. And then there's a retrospective TIA, which is a retrospective analysis after the fact, after the impact had happened, studying the true impact of the job. And there's different pros and cons of each. What I'll also tell you is, you know, like I said, let's not spin the truth here. The most successful you can be is when you're being as honest as you can be, because, you know, if you're not, it's generally no. If you know, people will look at the data, they'll know where it's got a little bit of holes. They'll also know when someone's being a little bit subjective, and we don't want that. In a way that you do that is obviously the accuracy of the schedule data, but also documenting the issue. You know, pulling together not what your opinion is, but what the data shows and what the correspondent says, and packaging it up. So when you put together that request, not only do you have an analysis that's using accurate data, but you also have documentation that supports your opinion as to causation and responsibility. Another piece is, you know, have this process in place where when you do submit a schedule, that there is an approval. You know, make sure that somebody's reviewed it, approved it. You know, don't use one that you've sort of didn't get somebody to talk about and agree to, that you didn't talk to them about some of the changes that were being made, because we need to make sure that the schedules are built with good quality. We need to make that any decision for changes have been discussed and are understood, and that the critical path is accurate and believable, and the schedule is achievable. If you do all these things, you will be in a situation where you don't have what I believe to be the worst thing to happen on a construction job, and that's a dispute. So let's talk about, I'll ask the crowd real quick, and I'll give you the quick answer. Do you know what the difference between a claim and a dispute is? Some people, believe it or not, don't know the difference. And to be quite honest with you, I used to use these words interchangeably, but it dawned on me at some point in time that there's a massive difference. A claim is it's a request. You know, it's basically a person saying, hey, I think I deserve more money because of something. Now, that is not a dispute. That is a request. A dispute is when somebody says, I disagree and I'm not paying for that. And then the other party says, well, I wholeheartedly think you should. And the other party says, well, you haven't proved it to me. So the claim is really a request, and the dispute is really a disagreement. And they're not one and the same.
The claim is when you call shotgun in the car and your older brother disputes that.
Exactly. But yeah, that was one thing. What we want to teach you here today is how to successfully ask for something and receive it without actually getting into an argument over it. And that's, you know, for a while I used to tell people I do claims, I do disputes, and it was like the same thing, but it's really not. Claim is a request, a dispute is an argument. And we're here to help you avoid that second one. So I'll talk a little bit about the Windows analysis. So the contemporaneous period or Windows analysis, which to me is the most common or most acceptable methodology, is basically taking your schedule update and comparing one update to the next, and then looking at what happened in that period. So, and doing, you could do that over multiple periods, but if you're doing contemporaneous schedule updates, which most contracts say you should, which even if the contract didn't say you should, I believe you should, because you had a plan. And we all know that things don't go as planned, and we all know that we want to have the opportunity to modify our approach at any given point in time. And we also want to look at the status and the critical path of the job at different points in time based on status updates and, you know, progress updates. And we want to know, you know, based on what's happened and what hasn't, where is the critical path and what are the float values of our activities that are coming up in the next few weeks. We want to know that. So this actually allows you to take each one of those updates as a period of time. So date of one update versus date of the next, see what the plan was based on whatever the plan was at the time, based on the sequencing that you might have altered, because we assume that these schedule updates are being used to manage a job, not tell a story. And then we assume that people are actually using the program as it was designed. And if they did make changes and it did alter the critical path, that they are understanding that and it is accurate. We are then able to see what was the plan, and then at the end of that period, understand what happened, knowing that at the end of the period, we might make some additional resequencings or adjustments to the plan going forward, and that should be fine. And as long as the contractor is using it correctly and not, overly compressing the schedule or, ripping out logic to tell a story or, adding things that would otherwise, point the finger at somebody else, we can use these schedule updates, and it does factor in the ability to make some procedural changes in our sequencing and our duration. So it views the period of time. It locks in a date and it says, okay, at that point in time, this is the world as I saw it. And at that point in time, a month later, this is the world as I saw it. And here's what happened in between. And I can then study that. And that's what that Windows analysis is like. So the first step in doing this is just obtain the relevant schedules from the start of the impact period. So say that, all of a sudden you realize that there was a delay in the last month or the last 2 months that happened, and you wanted to be able to prove that delay. I'd go find the first schedule, which is the plan at the beginning of that impact period or before the impact period, and then show the schedule update, grab any and all schedule updates that extend to after that delay period was over. So it could be update 5 through 7, or it could be update 5 through 15, or it could be update 2 through 20. I don't know, but you want to grab every single update and you want to look at each period as a window into that point in time. Next thing you do is you review those schedule updates and you look at the critical and near critical paths from period to period. Reason you want to look at the critical path, because that's the only path that can delay the job. And near critical path, I like to look at as well, because that can become critical. And it also might be arguable that it was critical. So you want to look at two of those things, because, if you think about the data out there and what I've seen, there's a lot of arguments as to what was truly critical. Like say on the near critical path, your durations were a little bit aggressive, and had they, been accurately assessed and they were twice as long as originally planned, that would mean that actually was the critical path. And you can play around with this information. So you want to look at both, and you want to make sure that you understand both. Next thing you do is you want to look at end date periods for the project. So if you look at one update and you say that the end date was, say, March 5th, and then you look at the next update and it says that the end date was, March 27th, which is my birthday, we got a 22-day delay from period to period. But you got to be responsible here, because sometimes, that can be misleading because of the changes that may have occurred that may have pushed the end date out or pulled it back in. But nonetheless, the first thing you want to look at is the end date variance from period to period. You also want to study from update to update whether or not that critical path shifted. Did it change to a different area? Did one area take over the critical path versus another? Or was it still through the same series of activities? You might see, let's just think of a multifamily building that obviously the framing and the structure of the first piece, sometimes it either gets into MEPs or windows and roof, enclosure stuff, and then ultimately it always goes through drywall and then into some finished trades up the building or along different sections. So you might see that change. You might see that it was in the structure, but now it's in the enclosure, and that pivot from one trade to the next is really important to understand, because that would have happened in the previous period, or it could have happened due to changes, and we want to know the difference. And then that's where you want to study the changes that may have influenced the end date as compared to, just flat out delay. And there's a way to do that called the half step we'll talk about, but I'll give you an example. Let's just look at a schedule here where I'm seeing the critical path. This is a schedule status date, the beginning of the impact period. We see that we were working in MEP rough in section 2, and then that was going to go into MEP rough in section 3. and then it was going to get into our finishes and closeout in section 3. This is a 3-section building. It's one building, but it's probably a long building. But we can see that the finishes and closeout, again, that's getting into our drywall on this building. But we see that MEP is driving the job in the second building. The first one's no longer on the critical path. It's the second leading into the third, leading into the finishes, and that's our end date. But if I do an update, I can see that, I updated it 2 months later, and now my end date's 9/18. It was 8/28. Now it's 9/18, and I can see that that historical critical path didn't change. I can see that we've lost time here. I can actually see that not only did we lose time there, but we lost about a month of time on the MEP. I can see that now my end date for finishing this section, I've modified it. We've decided to break that tie. That's only started a week later, and now it's getting done only a week earlier. So they've shortened this duration slightly. But I can still see that the critical path's going through MEP rough. This MEP rough section 3 didn't get started. This MEP rough is taking longer, to the tune of about a month, and the end date shifted out 20 days. So I can see here that my impact was likely in my MEP rough section 2, possibly in MEP rough section 3. But I want to study what was going on here, because my critical path is not completely changed, and that would really be the easiest way to then have a discussion. And if I did a second update, I'm looking at it again. Now I'm getting done on 11/1. Now my MEP rough got done on 2/10, even though we predicted 3/6. It actually was done on 2/10. Shortly after there. Now we're seeing that we're delayed here to 5/22, which is, it's still saying it's getting done earlier, but we're seeing that something's going on here, that section 2 finishes is now critical. So something's going on here. We're trying to figure this one out. We can see that the end date's shifting out. We can see that for whatever reason, maybe something's happening in section 3, but we're also seeing that for whatever reason, the section 2's now the critical path. So now we've actually seen a change in the critical path that went from this section to that section, and we've got to understand that. And now we see the turnover and punch is taking it over. And that's what we've got to study, is how did that happen? And that's all going to be contained in the logic. But that's just me using the data as is, looking at 2 different windows, seeing what the critical path was in one period, going to the next. And that's really where you can start to create what we call a delay table. Period 1, we see delayed progress of MEP rough in section 2 and section 3. Next one, we see delayed progress of MEP rough in section 3. We quantify that delay. We see that this went from 9/18 to 11/1, which was, I got the math wrong. I think this is actually supposed to be, sorry, I got the math wrong. This should be 43 days on top. So my apologies on getting that math wrong, but just that's an example of how you would create a delay table, and then you would root it back to what the historical critical path was in that period. And then obviously, sometimes we have things that change, and I'll give you another example here. And I'm trying to get this done by about 6 minutes from now so Billy can get started. But here's another project where I see a critical path. I do an update. I see all of a sudden my end date my start date didn't start until, 2 months later. That's real easy. We can just see that it pushed out. And then I see that we even had a 7-day delay to our soldier pile start, which now I can see that this end date moved out 79 days. But, when I add up the delays, if I'm looking at, 5/4 to 7/22, that's 79 days, but my start date was only pushed out 70 days. So I know that something happened in the future of the schedule to add an additional 9 days, but my only delays were, added up to 70 calendar days. So we have to study in that period. Well, what did they change in this sequencing to add another 9 days when I'm studying my end date variance versus my actual delay that had happened? Going to the next period, we'll see that we lost 104 days. We lost 104 days to excavation, so 2/5 to 6/6, and we also lost a few more 16 days to the install interior waste and soil at the foundation. So our foundations lost some time as well. So the collective delay here would be 120 days, although the end date only moved out 74 days. So I want to look at both of those. I want to study, how late are we compared to the plan? I look at the latest activity on the critical path. I compare that to what the critical path was and what that activity was supposed to get done. And I study that, and it was 120 days, even though my end date's only moved out 74 days. So I want to study the delay separate. I want to compare the last critical activity as to when it was supposed to get done and when it actually got done. And then compare that to what happened to the end date. And you'll see that in a lot of cases, these things are different. So this thing got mitigated, what's that, 46 days. And you can actually see it. You can see that compression happening here, but you want to be able to decipher what was the actual delay and what was the response to that as you're coming up with the request. You need to decide, if you're the contractor, you want to talk about the 120 days, and then you want to talk about what's this compression mean for the job. If we're going to get 45 days back, which is a month and a half, are we going to have to work weekends? Are we going to have to, get more tradespeople here working longer hours? I don't know, but that needs to be factored into this. Or is this the contractor saying, listen, I know we lost 120 days. These are the issues that caused that. It wasn't my issue. But what we can do is we can capture, we can shorten some of this float. We can compress a little bit, and we think that we'll still be done, on budget at that point in time. We're not going to add any inefficiencies, but you do need to understand these things. And then there's another situation where we actually saw that we gained 21 days, and then we lost 21 days at the same time. So in addition to these things happening, we see that we actually recovered some time. We got done with these FRP walls. We did this out of sequence to recover. There was a leave out, and then we lost another 21 days, which is a net impact of 0 days. But we also see that we've now used the schedule to push the end date out another 60 days. So these are just things that you need to be understanding as you go. But it's all about studying the impact of the history and studying the changes to the future. And really, that just continues going on, and that's how you do this Windows analysis. There's a few pros and cons of this. Number one, I think it's, when you're using the correspondence of the scheduled data that you're using to manage the job, knowing that changes are happening and knowing that that's allowed and that you can resequence and should resequence as long as it's not overly aggressive or overly optimistic, and that this is being used as a management tool, you're actually using real good data that's trustable. You can also show this, period to period. So if you're doing update monthly, and if you're studying it monthly, you should be having that discussion monthly of, okay, here's what delayed the job last month, and here's what our response was to maybe get some of that time back. But we weren't able to get all of it back, or if we're going to try to get some of it back, we're going to have to accelerate, and here's why it's not my fault. Here's why it's, related to the RFI, or related to the weather, or related to the change order that came about, or related to, supply chain issues, whatever it may be. This can be done during a project, and this should be done during a project. And there's less room for manipulation. Now, that's not 100% true. Sometimes people use the contemporaneous update to spin a story, but that's where I'm saying if you get caught doing that, you're sort of screwed, because that's then going to be the last time the owner trusts you going forward. So I wouldn't do that. It can be time consuming and expensive to prepare, especially if you're going to call a guy like me or one of my former lives to come look at the whole job up until the most current update when you're at like 95% complete. This was a real project. Doing it manually is going to take 2 months, and it's going to be arguable because of the changes that may have been happening. You can see there's this push-pull effect, but with that end date. But that's one thing, is it can be very time consuming unless you're doing it on a regular basis or you're using a software like SmartPM. I'm just going to plug. That's okay. It may not be possible to complete if the delay is not known or understood at the time. That's another, if you're not looking at it closely every single time, it may result in compressed schedules that are critical paths are arguable, and then pretty soon it's, you're put into a situation where, the critical path that's inaccurate is now being the one that you're relying on for the delay. So when you make too many egregious changes and you're too overly optimistic, or you're ripping out logic to tell a story and you really believe it and you're lying to yourself, then you have an arguable critical path. You actually have a bigger problem because you got a critical path that's not the true critical path of the job that you're managing to, all the while trying to tell a story as to why it wasn't your fault. And the other issue is this, and this is to all you owners out there. You know, sometimes the owner doesn't want to admit it. Owner doesn't want to pay for something that hasn't panned out, but that's okay. The contractor just submitting the claim at the time, you know, the owner should be, you know, understanding of the fact that this is going to be a harder lift now. What they always want is to get done on time, but I have noticed the further out you start asking for extension of time, the owner has to make a decision as to whether or not they want you to accelerate, which some cases they're willing to pay for, or some days they're able to, you know, adjust the date for which delivery is going to be and plan around that. But in a lot of cases, some owners are unreasonable and they don't want to sign anything until it actually pans out. Documenting it at that point in time isn't going to cost you any money until you prove it out. But I still say do it as soon as you can. And if they just want to say, wait, let's just see how it pans out, you do it for every single delay, and then you see how it pans out, all the while trying to mitigate these things. Now, how about when there's a issue? How about when there's an issue when somebody keeps changing the data on the data date such that, you know, delays are happening but end dates aren't changing? We have what's called a half-step analysis, and I want to do this really quick. A half step basically is where you take the plan. Here's my original plan and here's my update. You can see that they both have the same or around the same end date. So April 20th, April 22nd. But you can also see that there's been some compression between this period of time, right? Here was our critical path. Now look at this. This activity shortened a little bit, but our end dates are really the same. I see delay happening. I see a lot of delay happening in this period. And the way in which you want to study that is to do what's called a half step. And that's where you take the data from this previous update. This was your plan, and you do what's called a status only update, which in SmartPM, all you got to do is roll it to the data date and revert the changes and say that, you know, give me the schedule if there were no changes. And that's what you do here. And you can see right here that if you do no changes and you essentially revert out all the changes that happen and say, I just want a status only update, you'll see that the end date actually pushed out to May 11th. So that was our delay in the period, was 21 days. But if you look at this schedule here, it says that the end date only moved out 2 days. So what happened is somebody made changes in the future of the schedule to compress. And that's what we need to know the difference. I want to know why those 21 days were there. And that's something that, you know, you got to study, and you could see that it was right here in this you know, superstructure activity, but nonetheless, in SmartPM, it's just going to tell you what delayed the job. But we can also see, well, what was the extent of changes, and then that's where we can then look at our half-step update and see that it went from May 11th to April 22nd. This is what the plan was. This is now a compressed version of that plan, and you know the difference between the two. So that's just the way in which you can also sort of show an owner like, well, wait a second, we did lose 21 days. It was due to this thing. Here's what we can do to get the schedule back on track. And you can see that it's compressing the job. And we actually give you a compression metric. But nonetheless, that's just one other example of something that you might want to point out as you have these discussions. I'm going to leave it to Billy to tell you about prospective time impact. Billy, I'm sorry I only gave you 22 minutes. It's just I talk, and I'm sorry about that. Billy, you there?
Oh, sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
Mike, I've been working with you for how long? I was planning on having less time than we planned for, so.
Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah, so prospective analysis, this one is probably the most used. I would say probably you guys have the best grasp on this one coming into it. Prospective, as it sounds, this would be used, or this is a technique when you have a future delay that you're anticipating. So we're talking about design changes, bulletins, you know, things that we're are changing about the project that are set to occur in the future that we are then going to model into the schedule. The purpose here is for you to go in and build out an activity and logic sequence that best represents the delay you're anticipating. We're going to drop it into the schedule, and then we are going to see how the schedule shakes out and get our possible delay that way. Usually these are performed by the scheduler. You definitely need a CPM scheduling tool to do this. And oftentimes they're required by the contractor in order to get time up front, especially when I think there are some federal government jobs that require that as well. So Mike, if we want to go to the next slide. Thanks. So first step is we got to identify the change, obviously. So we need to understand what impact we're anticipating, whether it's I guess you can anticipate a hurricane with that weather event we have listed there, but we have, obviously we need to identify what we have going on. The next step is going to be to develop that fragment. Now this is the most important part. Mike hit on it a bunch early, just being detailed and being accurate with and not overestimating your time frames. This one you've got to think through a few things. We need to get the best and most accurate duration for your sequence of activities in this thing, right? We need to be, I would usually say, be conservative with it, but we do need to have a well thought out and documented reasoning for the duration of the impact we're going to drop in. And something that's often not thought of is the logic sequencing, just as, if not more important, as the duration. So understanding what activities in our schedule this impact's going to affect, and building it out in a way that those activities are only impacted. If you've got a project with phase A and phase B, and only phase B is going to be impacted by that change, let's say, you don't want phase A to be shifting with any of the inserted fragments you're going to be dropping in, which kind of leads into the third point here, inserting that fragment into the schedule. So this is where, Mike, if you want to hit next, this is where we're going to get dropped into our CPM schedule. So this is where we're actually doing the button clicking. We've gone through, we've identified the durations and the impacted activities. We're dropping this thing into the schedule itself. And we want to see how that affects by rescheduling the impacted schedule. We want to go ahead and click
now,
next
one quick comment there. It's got to be the most recent schedule. It's got to be a forward-looking plan, and key in on this word, copy of a schedule. So don't you've got your contemporaneous project schedule of record, and then you've got the side schedule, as a starting point for you to do the fragment. So you don't want to overwrite. That's one issue. If you overwrite, sometimes that can become a problem as well. But you can always just do the activities. But I always like to make a copy so that you have a completely separate schedule with a completely separate name.
Absolutely. And then we're going to reschedule it. So we're actually going to run that schedule now, where we want to, if you're creating a copy and you've got some as-built data you're dropping into it as well, you want to make sure that's in there. Have the latest and greatest version of the schedule. The reason for that is to make sure your critical path is the most up-to-date that it's going to be, because you could see shifts in your critical path depending on the logic ties. And then you're simply going to compare that copy with your original version of the schedule. The in-date variance is your impact from that fragment. As we'll take a look at in an example later on, one thing to keep in mind with this is that your fragment, if you have, let's just say you have a 30-day fragment you've entered in, your impact may not be 30 days depending on your critical path. If you're affecting a near critical or not critical path with this impact, you may get 10 out of those 30 days actually impacting your end date due to float erosion there. So that's key to know. We want to compare, and we can't just assume we have a 30-day event and that's 30 days we're going to be on, because that may not be the case. So we can kind of fly through these. Obviously, you want to use a project management software, P6, Microsoft Project. Obviously, we're going to hammer this. I actually have a blog out today talking about this a little bit, being as accurate and detailed as possible. We want to make sure that we are not overestimating. Really, that's kind of the cardinal sin that we see most often, overestimating those impacts, trying to get the most bang for your buck. So be accurate and be reasonable. Consider, like I said, consider the impact on the activities in your schedule. If it's a weather event, you're probably only going to want to affect the weather susceptible activities, right? Those outdoor activities. And finally, get everybody in a room. Let's talk about this. Let's work through it. Let's be collaborative, and let's not try and railroad this situation. So this is a very straightforward example. We can see here we have a March update. You can see the critical path there in red, going through the excavation and earthwork and then into the podium, so forth and so on. And in this case, as Mike mentioned, you would make a copy of this schedule. If we want to go ahead and go to the next slide, you can see, there we go. You can see that we have inserted that time impact number 1, unforeseen conditions there, going from March 3rd to May 30th. And we have that directly tied into excavation and earthwork, which makes all the sense in the world, right? So we can see now that we have pushed our schedule out from 4/16 to 5/17, understanding that the impact of this unforeseen condition situation is about a month, and it can be as straightforward as that. This is a very simple example. It starts to get a little bit more tricky when it's not just unforeseen conditions. Okay, we can't dig, right? Making sure those logic ties are tied in, especially as we get out into the future and we're dealing with uncritical activities. Is something you definitely want to document and lay out the reasoning behind. Hey, we put a finish to start tie here because of X. We added a start to start tie here because of Y, right? Make sure you document.
Yeah, one other point here is this is a summary schedule. First of all, when you're producing something to show to somebody, it's always good to summarize the schedule to, what do you want to call level 1? Sometimes maybe a level 2, level 3. Where you're looking at trade and area, but this is a level 1, and in the actual schedule file itself, this may be 10 activities that are logically tied. You want to show that fragment, but then you also want to give that summary version and make it as consistent as it was at that summary level, so that the person that you're explaining it to can digest it in their head, and then all these dates line up. This is something that we just as consultants would need to do, because you didn't want to just have a 30, 40, 50 page Gantt chart and just say, here you go figure it out. You want to also bring it to light at the highest level. A lot of people don't want to go study and rip through pages and try to learn that. So this is a summary version. And yeah, you want to actually show that fragment too, of what it looked like over what things need to get done in what periods, because that's going to be your contemporaneous record. But then you do this comparison. Sorry, Billy, you keep going.
Yeah, the comparison's the next step, right? It's that visual. What I've learned as a consultant is visualization is everything. You can have all the T's and C's and all your documentation for the attorneys and the people who are more detail orientated, but when you're just dealing with an ask like this is one of the most powerful things you can put forth. Just a summarized graphic on top of each other. Here it was before the impact, here we are after. It's clear as day for everybody to see. So, the pros here obviously can be used to predict a potential impact. Now the con there is that the flip side is based on assumptions and estimates, which may not be accurate or overestimated. It can be used to support a request for a time extension before the delay occurs, so you can get settled up and keep cash flow positive. But it may not be accepted, right? So when you run into a situation where the prospective analysis is not necessarily going to be the way to go, the next step is the next option you're going to have, and the third option in our deck here is going to be the retrospective time impact analysis, which this is opposite of the prospective. So instead of kind of getting the delay on the come and putting it out there, what we're going to do is wait for the full event to take place and then model it this way. So where before we were working on the right side of the data date and building out the impact in the future, now we've experienced, in this case, we've experienced the impact. We know exactly how long it took. We know exactly what activities it affected. And now we're going to take this latest schedule update that we have, and we're going to build it in the left side of the data. So this is usually Move to the next one. So once again, it's kind of the same steps. We're going to identify that the event occurred, right? And we're going to document that through photos, daily reports, RFIs, change orders, whatever. We're going to model the delay in the project schedule exactly like we did with the prospective. But once again, we have the answer to the question now. We know how long it took. We know what activities it affected. So there's less guesswork here. And we're building it in the actual side of our plan. And then we'll compare the resulting schedule, right? We're going to calculate the impact of the delay event, and we're going to document it as a TIA. Now, TIAs can be complex, and I'm a little bit ahead of you here, Mike. We got 10 minutes left, so I'm kind of flying right now. TIAs can be a complex and time-consuming process, but they're very valuable. And in my opinion, this retrospective time impact analysis is my preferred way to do it, because, like I said, you have the answer to the test here. Now we're just figuring out, okay, objectively, how did this affect my schedule? So to move on to the quick example. So what we're going to do here is show the difference in how that same unforeseen condition delay impacted our schedule differently once we let the dust settle and we understood the duration of that impact. So here's that exact same summary schedule. Moving in, we can now see where before that unforeseen condition, we actually planned it to run through April 30th, right? Now, what ended up happening is it took until June 5th to get cleaned up and cleared out. So that's an additional month and a week or two that we actually could have gotten had we not submitted early with the prospective analysis. So now what I get to do here is drop that in. I've created an update. And one of the key things here is, and you want to produce this retrospective time impact analysis in and amongst your normal schedule updates, right? You do not want to go create a schedule update and only drop in this fragment here and don't pay attention to all the normal activities you would be adjusting and updating in your normal schedule update. So as we go through and adjust critical path and logic ties and durations and add and delete other activities and put progress in actual start, actual finish, percent completes, that critical path and the rest of your schedule is going to be adjusting with it. And so once again, this falls back into that category of we have more knowledge about our project, so we're going to have a more accurate TIA here. So that will really allow that retrospective analysis to play into your normal updating flow and give you the most accurate impact on your end date possible at this point. So in this case, we went from May 17th was our prospective impact. Here we're looking at June 25th out there. So we're getting about an extra month and a week there in delay time. Yep, and once again, stack them on top of each other. That's the best way to visualize it. I talked a lot about the pros here. It's difficult to do this. It is. This is where you really need to make sure you're documenting, you're keeping those records at hand in order to prove this out. This is where the prospective, everybody's guessing, right? Nobody has that crystal ball. Now, the retrospective, everybody may have a different version of history. And so you want to make sure that your records are kept well so that you can prove your view of it. The owner may want to see if the contractor can recover from it. So this is another situation where they may kick the can down the road on the contractor and say, okay, well, let's go find some mitigation strategies out in the future before we start trying to pay this off, depending on who's at fault. But ultimately, this is the best type of TIA. The best type of TIA will depend on the specific circumstances. Contractually, obviously, that's going to be the number one thing. Yeah.
One other piece I'll add is, and that's the third con is, if you notice that the anticipation was a month, but it actually took, a month and a half or two, but it actually took 3, you're going to need to prove that the contractor that's requesting it can't go by the assumption that, even that time impact wasn't delayed by them. Say that they didn't show up with resources one day, or the subcontractor just didn't do it. They focused elsewhere. You have to prove throughout all of that sequencing that any and all further delays were unavoidable. which, you know, the owner is going to immediately want to go to. So that's where we get into being as honest as you can, you know, with yourselves as well as the owner, that, you know, this has all been fully documented. All of these things, this is how it panned out, and there was no other way it would have panned out. There was no other way that we could have controlled how it panned out, because that's going to become the question. And that's something that you need to prove out through your correspondence, is that, yeah, well, we waited, and this is how long it took to get the material delivered, and this is how long it took for, you know, an entire crew that we planned for to install it, and they were being as productive as possible, you know, and then here's where it rained, and whatever it may be. You have to have that whole story, you know, buttoned up, and that's done through the correspondence. You can't just assume that, well, it took 3 months, so that's how long it took, and that's how long, and then I didn't cause any problems there. You have to prove that out, because somebody's going to want to, you know, prove to you that maybe it could have been done better. So this is a lot of information. The perfect process here, I think, is a combination of both. First of all, when you have this issue, you want to map it out, and you want to map out, you know, what changed in my schedule, and what's the result. And that's really by taking the prospective TIA. You want to document the issue and prepare the request. You want to show, okay, and you want to do a best case scenario. You know, don't say, well, it could take 4 months, so I'm going to drop in a 4-month fragnet, which is going to push the end date out 4 months, and hopefully we'll do better. No, you want to think, what if it goes as best as planned? That's what I want to do. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that this goes as best as planned, and I'm even going to mitigate some of that delay down the road by being smart with how I can resequence a few things. I want to have minimal exposure here, and I want to prove to the owner how I'm going to get that minimal exposure, and that's your TIA. Document the issue and prepare the request via change order. Reserve the right to modify the change. You know, in that change order, say, here's what I think is going to happen, and this is the best case scenario, and here's what I'm going to do to mitigate as much as I can down the road. We're going to have a few Saturdays that we work, or, you know, we're going to shorten some durations here. We're going to stack a couple trades because I think I can get more resources to recover from this on some of these critical activities down the road. And this is how I'm going to do the minimal exposure, because now you're working for them. Document and issue the request. Reserve the right. Say, I don't know if this is going to happen, but here are all the things that need to happen for us to achieve this. This is not a, you know, way too many contractors look at this as a right to, you know, push out the end date as far as possible. And that doesn't go well. You know, you want to be playing on the same team. You want to be honest with yourself. You want to be honest with them. But that's where you're going to get them to reserve the right. So I don't know how this is going to go, but I promise you I'll be tracking it very closely. Document that true as-built data and study it retrospectively afterwards, and then revisit that time extension. And if necessary, prove out why did it take longer than planned, and how is that not my fault? And be very honest with the documentation. And then, you know, like I said, you got to be 100% honest with yourselves and the owner on causation and responsibility. If there is something that you did that prolonged this, you just be honest with it, you know, and then talk about it. Because what I've noticed with owners is a lot of times they just want to know. They also want to feel fairly treated, you know, and they want to know where you might have been able to do better. And if you admit that, they are much more prone to not only signing it, but actually giving you a little bit more time, and maybe even a few extra dollars, because they know that this person that I'm working with is being honest with me and not trying to screw me over. And that is really where I see a lot of
working with our ownership customers, that is the prevailing wisdom, is I just want to know the delay so we can work through it, right? And just come to me with that.
Yeah, and one thing I'll also say is this is a time-consuming process that sometimes requires specialization. We did build SmartPM to do all three things at once. We have the ability for you to put in a prospective TIA. We have the ability to track against that. We have the ability to do a retrospective TIA and revert it back in history to then determine exactly how many days of critical path delay happened and how many were supposed to. And we also have the ability to look at the schedule without the TIA to see, you know, what was the delayed work, and that is that tied directly to the additional work that we're talking about, and button it all up by looking at it 3 different ways at the click of a button. because I know that this is time consuming. And since we talked about time being of the essence in construction, we don't want to be spending that money on that consultant. People don't like getting things from consultants because then they know that, you know, you're ready to get into a fight over it. So we're trying to help people do this right, do this quick, and get everybody on board. Data speaks, and that's where, you know, we see the best collaboration come. But yeah, be timely.
On this slide, the document everything, this is a shameless plug. We do have a blog out that I wrote this morning on LinkedIn and wherever else they posted it. But if you don't document everything and you're not timely with your requests, you know, the details will become hazy and things will get murky, and a claim will turn into a dispute. And that's when you get some 20-something-year-old kid on your site and you're 90 grand in the hole just to get the story back to where it could have been in the beginning. So yeah, we wrote about all that. So all of this can help avoid that claim, or I'm sorry, that dispute. And hopefully you guys take away some good tidbits here.
Yeah, and the last piece is to review the contract to figure out if one of these methodologies is supposed to be utilized. Obviously, you can consult with an attorney. In a lot of cases, I want to make sure that, you know, we don't even go down that road. That's when you're getting into the claim versus the dispute versus the claim. A request doesn't require necessarily an attorney, but if you're not understanding of what the contract language means, you can consult with them. But guys, thank you so much. There is one question, and I will answer it from my good old friend Tony Bolstad. We worked together on an LA job about 10 years. Actually, me and Billy worked with Tony. Question is, for the retrospective TIA, are you still using the copy of the schedule just before the delaying event? Or are we taking the most current schedule and unstatusing back to the start of the delaying event? Actually, good question. If you're truly, you can do both. As a matter of fact, that's what I was getting at with SmartPM. What you can do is, I like to take the retrospective as-built data as is. I like to then go look at, well, what could it have been? So what should the plan have been and what actually panned out? And, you know, not assume that that it's the same, although you can assume that it's the same. You can look at both. You can destatus the job, but, you know, generally I like to always take a look at it like, what was a plan? You know, what was the most optimistic plan that could have happened and what actually happened? And that's what you can do, Tony, and SmartPM, is you can create that fragment after the fact with as-built data, but you can put in plan dates that could have been different than actual, and you can do a destatus version and revert it back to the revert that TIA back to the previous version of the schedule, and then rerun the delay analysis, and it will tell you exactly what the delay should have been from the beginning and what it actually was. And it will then it will tell you when you inserted this in a best case scenario, what was the impact as it panned out, what actually happened, what was the true impact, and then it will tell you for each one of those items in your fragnet which ones delayed the job, and then you can get into the responsibility of those items. Like maybe somebody didn't respond to the RFI quick enough, or maybe it was the fabrication that took too long. But yeah, you can do both. And yeah, that's, you know, you can do a retrospective TIA that looks like a prospective one after the fact.
I would say do both, and for different reasons for each. So you would use the schedule just before the delay occurred, because that's reflective of your plan at that time, right? So as we were incurring this delay in real time, this is what our critical path looked like, and that's why we made the decisions we made, right? And so you're kind of reflecting your thought process at that moment. You would then use the most recent update to then incorporate any concurrent delays that may have been occurring elsewhere. So if you're dropping in other retrospectives, if you made decisions in your schedule that altered the critical path as well, you can get that view too. So having both of those at your disposal, and then deciding which one to go with based on what the story you want to convey is, will give you that option.
Another comment we got, and would be great to do a webinar on each type using SmartPM. Well, maybe we'll make that our next one. We actually were trying to do that for today, but we realized that we had way too many slides, so we would just focus on, you know, the concepts first. but happy to do that as well if anybody's interested. We could also do a demonstration for you.
So if you guys visit help.smartpmtech.com, there's a section in there called on-demand training. At the very bottom of that on-demand training is the advanced features, and there's videos from yours truly, I think still, that you can watch and where we actually use SmartPM to do some of this modeling.
Yeah, well, we'll follow up. Actually, somebody had asked if we would get the recording. We'll get the recording out.